Ladies and gentlemen, we need to be much better in the way we manage land. I will argue in this talk that most solutions for more sustainable land use are already known. Not only do we know them, but we already implement it with success in a few places in the world. The major challenge now is how to upscale these solutions. I will illustrate this point by discussing tropical deforestation. Today, we're still losing about 8 million hectares of dense, humid forest every year. This has a major impact on carbon dioxide emissions, on biodiversity loss, that's the main cause of biodiversity loss, on the water cycle, soils, etc. 40% of the tropical deforestation is associated with the production of 4 commodities that are being exported on the global market. These are palm oil, soy, beef, and timber. And as a result, a number of policies have been designed to reduce deforestation. Let me illustrate 3 of these policies. One, we call it payments for ecosystem services. This is a scheme where forest owners are being compensated for preserving their forest because these forests do deliver some services for society or for downstream land managers. If I keep my forest intact, therefore I will sequester more carbon from the atmosphere, I will preserve biodiversity, my forest will deliver some clean water downstream, so it will be normal for me to be compensated for that service. That's why we've designed schemes known as payment for ecosystem services. Do they work? We conducted one large experiment in Uganda. We conduct what we called a randomized controlled trial. We selected 120 villages just next to a very large national park. And we randomly assigned these villages, 60 of these villages, to a treatment, a policy intervention, and 60 were controlled villages. We didn't do anything. We just observed what was going on. The intervention was very simple. We went into these villages. We talked to every farmer. And we told them, if you commit not to clear forest on your land, we'll pay you $25 per year and per hectare. Then we tracked these villages over several years. We measured by remote sensing, very high resolution remote sensing, the tree cover. Actually, we used artificial intelligence techniques to map tree cover. We did that before the intervention and at the end of the intervention after 2 or 3 years. Interestingly, we were able to decrease deforestation by more than 50% just with that payment, which is a very cheap way to achieve nature conservation. So these payments for ecosystem services do work. Second type of policy interventions. A number of NGOs or other types of organizations have designed eco-certification schemes. These are very simple. A standard is being defined that prescribes a number of sustainable land use practices. It's being offered to companies and producers. If they decide to enter that scheme, they will be audited every year to make sure that they do comply to the standard. If they do, their production receive an eco-label. These are all the eco-labels just for coffee. And therefore, they can sell their coffee, in this case, at a price premium. And they also can gain access to markets which, like these niche commodities, highly sustainable products. Do they work? We did another study in Colombia, in this case. We selected a large sample of farmers, more than 400 of them. Some of them were eco-certified as part of the Rainforest Alliance scheme. And we paired each eco-certified farm with a neighbor that was not eco-certified. But because they were neighbor, they were growing their coffee under very similar conditions. Same soil, same climate, same market access. Moreover, we made sure that the farm size was equivalent and that a number of socioeconomic attributes of these farmers were comparable. So they were very similar, except that one was eco-certified and the other one was not. We overlaid all these farms on our satellite images, a time series of satellite images, and again, we mapped changes in tree cover using the same techniques as in the previous study. And what we found is that farmers that are eco-certified, in green here on this graph, have much more reforestation on their farm than the farmers that are not eco-certified. Because the standard, the Rainforest Alliance standard for coffee production, requires them to grow coffee under agroforestry systems. It also requires them to plant trees along rivers, on steep slopes, etc. So in this case, it works. Another study also on eco-certification was in Chile, where there the issue is that there's a lot of clearing, or there was a lot of clearing of biodiversity-rich primary forest in order to plant eucalyptus or pines for export. That's what we see in red on this map. So all the red here, as measured by satellite, are areas where the forest, the natural forest, was destroyed in order to have these monospecific plantations. In about 2001, a couple of eco-certification schemes were proposed under market pressure. And in these schemes, these forest managers committed not to clear natural forest for plantation anymore. Did it work? When again, we have some treatment control. We see on this map that there's no more red. That means that all these farms, all these forest managers that agreed to get eco-certified abandoned that practice. Now look, we had a very, very large sample, more than 4,000 properties that we could map across the entire country. So again, that's another example where eco-certification promotes more sustainable practices. Third type of intervention. A number of progressive companies are trying to promote a more sustainable sourcing of the products that they are transforming or that they are selling. We worked with a couple of these companies. This is one example of a retailer in South Africa. And they developed a program where over many years, they would help all the farmers they are buying fruit and vegetables from. They are helping them to adopt better practices on their farm. They send some agronomists every year to advise them and to check what they do on the farms. That company agreed to share all the audit data with us. Again, a rather large farm. We got audit for over 9 years for all these farms. And we could again compare these farms to farms that were not in that scheme. Again, creating a control group. And by analyzing this data, we saw that the farms in this scheme had much better practice in terms of legal compliance, but also were very good at adopting better soil and water management practices that improve the environment. Again, a very simple scheme that seems to work quite well. A few countries have adopted a mix of multiple interventions to protect their forest. The three I've just described and a few more. And as a result, they were able to completely reverse the deforestation at the national scale. This is Vietnam. Here we have the years. We cover more than 1 century. This is forest cover. What fraction of the country is under forest cover, from 70% all the way to 0%. we see that Vietnam had very rapid rates of deforestation. Until the late 80s, early 90s, when a series of policies not only ended deforestation, but completely reversed the trend, and you have now a rapid increase in tree cover. Now, I need to mention that about half of that reforestation is natural forest regeneration. That means rich in carbon and in biodiversity. The other half are mostly plantations, which are good to produce timber, but have a very low biodiversity value. But still, they do provide some ecosystem services. An even nicer example is Costa Rica, where you see the same trend, a decrease in deforestation. It even accelerates here, and then suddenly a complete reversal. And now you have a much larger fraction of Costa Rica under forest cover. So we could be very happy to see these positive success stories. Unfortunately, there's another side to these stories, which I'm going to tell you now, which relates to what we call leakages or spillovers. Often in these very complex systems, as you intervene somewhere, you have these spillovers on other countries or other sectors. I will give you 3 examples. For example, as Vietnam was adopting a ban on logging, it was not allowed anymore to log trees from their forest. If you would stand at that time at the border between Vietnam and Laos or Vietnam and Cambodia, that would be a very common sight, these trees transporting timber from Laos and Cambodia into Vietnam. A large fractions of these trees have been felled illegally in these countries. In other words, what Vietnam was doing was just offshoring its deforestation, displacing its deforestation to its neighbor. What fraction was offshored? Well, we quantify that through complex accounting techniques that I'm not going to describe. We see that there's a big increase in the volume of timber that was imported into Vietnam. This is equivalent to about 40% of the forest regrowth in Vietnam, which means that that forest transition story in Vietnam is a story of a glass 60% full, 60% of the reforestation was real global reforestation, but 40% empty, 40% was just displacing deforestation to other countries. Second example, Bhutan. Also in Bhutan, you have an increase in forest cover over the last couple of decades. And Bhutan being this small, tiny, remote, isolated kingdom in the Himalayas, clearly we thought they would not displace their resource use to other countries. And if you look over the years, in blue, all the wood production, in green, all the wood consumption, all the way to 2006, every year they more or less produce what they are consuming. They are self-sufficient in wood. But in 2006, there are new policies to protect forest. You see that wood production decreased in blue, wood consumption increased dramatically. There's only one way you can do that. It's by importing wood from your neighbors, which is exactly what Bhutan was doing. It increased dramatically its import of timber and mostly charcoal from India. 40% of the wood consumed in Bhutan was coming from India. But in that case, it may not be a bad story, because that timber in India was coming from very well-managed plantations. While in Bhutan, you have this very biodiversity-rich primary forest that you would rather protect. Third example of leakage or spillover, which is slightly more complicated in this case, Costa Rica. I've already mentioned forest cover increased, that's what you see in red here, mostly by abandoning some of the cattle pasture that they had in Costa Rica. Cattle pasture is a very inefficient way of using land. it doesn't yield a lot of value per hectare when it's very extensive as it was in Costa Rica. So they expand forest on this pasture, but they invest a lot in very intensive agriculture for fruit production. Some oil palms, but mostly bananas and pineapples. They have a very high yield. They yield a very high value per hectare. So if your yield is 3 times higher, then you need 3 times less land, and you can spare land for forest. That allows your forest to regrow in your country. But here also, there was a completely unanticipated leakage. If you grow and export pineapple and bananas, while you have to export them, you have to transport them to the ship, to the truck, etc. How do you do that? Well, you need a lot of wood pallets to transport your fruits. Where do you get your wood from? Well, from your forest. And so now you have this spillover from the agricultural sector to the forestry sector. So you intensify agriculture to spare land for forest, but now you destroy your forest in order to transport your fruits. Completely unanticipated cascading effect. These are very difficult to account for. So what I'm showing here that we do have these solutions, they work, but they tend to stay small. There are a number of payments for ecosystem services programs in the world, more than 500 of them. But the total value of money transfer for ecosystem services is less than 0.1% of the value of international trade. A tiny, tiny fraction. There are many, many eco-certification schemes for more than 200 commodities. But typically, the market share of these eco-certification schemes is around 2 to 20% in the best cases. And they stay there. It's impossible to go above that. There are a number of progressive companies that invest in sustainable sourcing, but maybe 300 of them out of more than 80,000 large multinationals in that sector, in the agribusiness sector. And there are 5 to 7 forest transition countries like Costa Rica, Bhutan, Vietnam. But of course, it's just 5 or 7 countries because they've just offshored their deforestation elsewhere. So the lesson here is that if small solutions work, if small is beautiful, big is necessary. We need to upscale these small solutions. What we've learned through these studies is that the challenge is not so much the speed of change. Remember the graph on Costa Rica. That was a very rapid transition. The challenge is the scale of change, how to create change at scale. Let me discuss that now. One key lesson from many studies we have conducted on that topic is that upscaling always requires some coalitions between the public sectors, local, national governments, between the private sectors, because they have this investment capacity, this great innovation capacity, and between civil society. Of course, these 3 groups of actors have very different motivations. They function according to very different modes. But when they agree to work together to solve one specific problem, that's where you can create change at scale. That's what happened with the big global program on malaria, tuberculosis, and other diseases. That's what happened for large global program for poverty. That's what needs to happen for sustainability. There are 2 ways to create these tipping points of adoption of these solutions. One is when public policies support, endorse, or even mandate some sustainability standards. The other one is when very large private companies that concentrate a very large fraction of the global trade in some commodities adopt these practices as part of the internal codes of conduct. If you look, for instance, for the sector of palm oil, which is one of the major causes of deforestation, 3 large multinational companies control about 80 to 90% of the global trade in palm oil. Which means that when each of these 3 companies adopt some sustainable sourcing practices, you have resolved 80 to 90% of the problem. Let me give you examples of these 2 pathways. First, the role of governments. And let's talk first about governments in the producing countries, where there is tropical forest and where these commodities are being produced. There are a few examples where national policies have integrated the most successful sustainability standards that had been applied by some of their producers. For instance, in Bolivia, there are large forest concessions given to private companies, and a few of these companies were certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC. And it worked very well. Forest management was much more sustainable, but also these companies were more profitable because they were able to send their timber to these niche markets. In the 90s, Bolivia decided to revise its forestry code and basically almost copy-pasted the standard from the FSC into the law. And therefore, that mandated the standard to all the concessions in the country. Another upscaling mechanism. But unfortunately, when there was a change in government in Bolivia a few years later, they kind of backtracked, and now there's a very high rate of deforestation in Bolivia again. Other example would be Mozambique, which recently adopted the Better Cotton Initiative, a sustainable production standard for cotton, into their national law. To reinforce that, governments from consuming countries that are importing these commodities can also endorse, support, or mandate some of these standards. One example, the European Union has a policy to prevent illegal timber trade, and they recognize the FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, and another label, PEFC, as proof of due diligence or due care by the companies that are importing this timber. That means that if these companies import timber that is FSC certified, they are automatically compliant with this policy from the EU. This is therefore creating a demand for certified products, certified timber, which again upscales the uptake of that set of practices. There are many other examples that I have no time to detail here. The second pathway is when large private companies integrated into their internal code of conduct, into their sourcing practices, some of these sustainability standards. For instance, more than 450 large multinationals have pledged to remove deforestation from their supply chain, which means they are committed that by 2020 and 2030, they are not going to buy any palm oil, soy, beef, timber from farms or concessions that have caused major deforestation. While 2020, that's in about 2 weeks, they will miss badly that target. They won't make it. But we're hopeful that by 2030, they will have made large progress. Now, once they make these pledges, how do they operationalize? How do they implement these pledges? Well, in most cases, more than 85% of these companies, by relying on third-party certification. Again, they create a big demand for these eco-certified products. Other companies like IKEA has committed also to only source timber that's FSC certified and textile that's coming from cotton that's also certified. We studied a very large sample of companies, reviewed all their reports and their websites to understand what kind of commitments they were making in terms of sustainable sourcing. We found that 50% of them, half of them, actually had adopted credible, sustainable sourcing practices. And a third of these were third-party audited, which means that compliance was verified by external independent actors. The companies most likely to make these commitments and implement them were companies with a very high brand value. Their reputation had a very high value. Very large companies, companies serving mostly European markets, because today that's where most of the pressure from consumers and citizens for sustainability is coming from. Consumer-facing companies, and interestingly, companies whose headquarters is located in a city or a country with many large NGOs. Civil society pressure does influence the adoption of these practices. One of the key challenges when we think about transforming an entire sector at scale is that there's a great heterogeneity between actors. Whether we talk about companies, countries, consumers, you always have some very, very progressive actors that will be motivated by the common good. But at the end of the gradient, you always have these laggards that just think about short-term profit just for themselves. A lot of the policies that I've described are voluntary, and therefore they tend to be only adopted by the most progressive companies. So you make the most virtuous actors even more virtuous, but you leave behind all the rest of the market. So you fail to transform the system at scale. That's why it's so important to develop what we call the hybrid governance, the public plus private form of governance, where you have multiple interventions, some public policies that are raising the floor for all actors, set a minimum bar that everyone has to meet, otherwise they are facing sanctions, plus some private policies where you provide incentives that will mostly be seized by the most progressive companies, plus some emulation between actors. So when a leader adopts a standard, it's being followed by its competitors in the market. It's really important to think in terms of multiple set of policies that are complementary. This complementarity can take multiple forms. In some cases, I've already described, a government or a private company absorbs an existing standard into its own functioning. In other cases, you have this carrot and stick configuration. The market provides some incentives for the leaders, but then the government comes with threat of sanction for the laggards. In other cases, you have a private entity, a company, an NGO, a roundtable of multiple actors that propose a new standard, but the adoption of that standard is being facilitated by the government. The government creates a series of enabling conditions. And then, in other cases, you have a division of tasks in the policy process. Maybe the government sets the agenda, the goals. The private sector is doing the innovation, the investment in the new practices. Some NGOs will monitor adoption, ensure compliance. So together, they divide the task to make sure that the system changes at scale. To conclude, I think I told you 4 things. First, indeed, we need all these small pioneering solutions, but not just that. We also need to think very carefully on what are the mechanisms to upscale this solution, to really create change at scale. Second, to succeed, we need to develop these synergies between multiple interventions, whether they are voluntary standards, market incentives, public policies, etc. Public-private partnerships, or we sometimes call them also multi-stakeholder initiatives, or hybrid governance, are really important. We can only solve these very complex problems if we work together. Antagonistic relationships between governments, private sector, civil society will not help us much to resolve these big issues. And as we do that, we always need to keep in mind that in any market, in any sector, we have actors that may be very heterogeneous. They may have very different motivations. And we need to make sure we find the levers that will move each of these categories of actors. Thank you very much.